Hello everyone, welcome back to the Gaming CPA's channel. Today we're going to do something a little new. I've been watching a lot of videos about British guy reacting to the US invade UK, like most amount of money or biggest military in the world. And I've been watching that, and I feel like it'd be kind of fun to be I'm a US citizen, and I'd like to react to could the US citizen defend themselves against the US Army? Because in watching all these videos, you just see the vast and just how massive the US Army is. Not only in obviously equipment like vehicles, planes, ships, but also people, and the budget and the bases. So I'm kind of curious as to what's going to happen in this video. Before we get going too further, if you guys want to smash the sub button, we're up to 160 subscribers, which is mind-blowing, which is awesome and incredible. So if you want to feel like supporting the channel, you can hit that sub button, and that really helps us out. So without further ado, let's go ahead and hop on into the video.
The United States has, without a doubt, the most heavily armed population in the world, with firearms being a part of daily life for many Americans. While in many nations the mere sight of a gun is an extremely rare occurrence, in the US some studies say there are almost as many guns as there are people, while others
I would believe this in a heartbeat. They're definitely, I know people who literally probably have at least 100 guns, at least, and it's a family of 3. So I mean, this is definitely true, because there are a lot of people that don't like guns, but there's a lot of people in the US that love their guns. So definitely believe that
say there are more. What is known, though, is that much like American income, the majority of guns are concentrated in the hands of a minority, with 3% of gun owners owning half of all guns in the United States. With this much firepower available to the citizens.
So think about that. If there's as many guns as there are people, that's 360 million population in the US. Half of that's 180 million guns, but only 3% own it. What is that? 9 million own 180 million guns? That is ridiculous.
Citizens of America. Does it really stand a chance against its own military? The U.S. military needs no introduction. It has the world's largest budget, more than the next 7 competitors, who are in order: China, Saudi Arabia, Russia, the United Kingdom, India, France, and Japan. Of $1.6 trillion spent on military budgets around the world, the United States accounted for 37% of the world's total. All that spending goes to support the largest military presence on Earth, with American bases spread out across every.
One thing I have learned in watching these reaction videos is the US is literally everywhere. We have the best naval because of our location. When we help out in the world, we need to have good navies so we can get places fast. Whereas other countries like Asia and Europe, they're all intercontinental, so they just have mass land forces. But we do have a massive navy, which also means we also build bases so we can access things faster.
Every continent except Antarctica. Greatly mistrusted for its all-encompassing reach, U.S. national strategy is in fact to avoid another major war, such as the 2 world wars and the countless wars that rocked continental Europe for centuries. U.S. forces are therefore pre-staged in potential conflict zones, where in conjunction with local allies, their presence alone is a deterrent to violence. The results are hard to argue with, seeing as there have been no wars between major industrialized powers since the end of World War II. The US may not necessarily field the best technology in every department. For instance, the Russians have for long fielded more sophisticated anti-air and electronic warfare weapon systems, but it does bring a unique capability that no other nation matches: the ability to field advanced technology across the board, and not just in select areas. This makes the American military a lethal force against any modern adversary.
Yeah, and that was one thing I'd seen is literally the US, the Navy, our submarines are 10 years ahead of Russia and 20 years ahead of China, which are the next 2 competitors with us. We have way more reconnaissance, more satellites, all these more modernized airplanes as well. We have a 5th gen airplane or something, and other countries only have 3rd gen or maybe a couple 4th gen, but no one else has a 5th gen. So it's incredible, man. It's incredible.
And has historically forced its.
Which means I'm getting real scared watching this. What's going to happen? But I'm thinking, man, there's 180 million guns, 360 million guns, 3% people, that's 9 million people, but they own that much. I'm thinking U.S. citizens might have a chance, maybe just by sheer numbers.
Major political adversaries to seek out niche strategies for holding the U.S. at bay. Russia, for instance, has for decades focused not on stopping a U.S. offensive outright, but in denying it the air power that would lead to a quick win. To this effect, they've focused on anti-air weapon systems to knock US planes and cruise missiles out of the sky, and advanced electronic warfare systems to disrupt the networked abilities of American weapons. While China tries to slowly build a naval presence capable of standing up to the US, it relies on a huge stockpile of ballistic missiles to deter the American Navy. In fact, China is the only major power in the world to have an arm of the military dedicated solely to ballistic missiles. Yet, while the US military has proven time and again it dominates the modern battlefield, it has historically had the exact same troubles that every other military has when it comes to fighting low-intensity counterinsurgency wars. When denied the use of its overwhelming firepower and technological advantages, the US military is in the same boat as any other nations and must rely on low-tech, door-to-door action against insurgent forces who don't use heavy equipment and don't wear uniforms. For all its military might, even the American military has great difficulties in fighting an insurgency war. Should the American people ever rise up against their own government and that government authorize the use of military force against its citizenry, the American insurgents will find themselves in an initially favorable position against the American military. For starters, US forces are widely dispersed around the world, meaning that unlike most nations, the least number of American combat troops and equipment is present at home as compared to overseas.
Now, obviously, that statement, least is at home, you got to realize because we have so many bases. I want to say we have like over 80 or 100 bases worldwide. Obviously, we are very well defended at home. Our coasts are very well defended. We have massive bases. Basically, the only way for people to come and attack us is by sea, and so our ports are very heavily defended. But it is true, most of probably the equipment and the troops are elsewhere just due to the fact that there's 80 to 100 plus bases around the world. And so if we have, 1+ million troops, most of them are going to be spread out probably around there. So there might not be as many in the homeland. So right off the bat, we probably would have a better chance of being
For
okay.
the first few weeks of the war, the insurgents will be able to carry out large-scale operations that will become impossible once more and more military equipment returns home. With the largest air and naval transport fleet in the world, this initial tactical disadvantage the military will find itself in will quickly be reversed. American insurgents could think themselves safe from major retaliation, seeing as no country ever truly wants to destroy its own infrastructure just to defeat an insurgency, let alone the world's richest nation whose cities, highways, railways, and ports are all vital arteries of global trade. Yet one of the US military's major tactical advantages against foreign adversaries will prove just as deadly effective against an insurgency. Smart weapons were first developed to take out pieces of Soviet hardware from afar with pinpoint accuracy. The ability to strike a specific target from hundreds of miles away was a major technological offset and a capability that Cold War Soviet military planners greatly feared. An inventory of networked American bombs and weapon systems could decimate entire troop formations and camouflaged artillery positions with ease, while Soviet planes would have to rely on traditional and very inaccurate gravity bombs and unguided rockets to strike back with. Smart weapons eventually spread around the world, but to date, no other nation has as large a stockpile or integration as the US, with the ability to strike at pinpoint targets.
Correct, and that also gets involved with the whole satellite ideas. We have so many satellites as well, which is kind of also what they work with. They have drones that fly, and they have people that use the drones to kind of spy someone and maybe pinpoint and put a laser on a target, which allows the rocket to find it. But also the satellite coverage is incredible.
And avoid collateral damage, American insurgents will quickly find themselves prey even in the heart of major cities. American surveillance assets are also amongst the best in the world. Having a nearly 20-year insurgency war under its belt, the American military has finally tuned itself for counterinsurgent operations and is today the leading counterinsurgency force in the world. Not only has it developed a slew of surveillance technologies to better locate and disrupt insurgent operations hiding amidst a civilian population, but more important, its troops are highly trained in conducting urban warfare ops, and the
That looks like one of the drones that my company makes.
Traditional fight for the hearts and minds. When the Soviets rolled into Afghanistan in the 80s, It did so as the world's biggest military juggernaut and crushed all stand-up opposition. However, within weeks, the war shifted from a conventional one to a counterinsurgency and war of attrition. The Soviets responded much in the Soviet way. Overwhelming firepower delivered very indiscriminately, and soon Soviet forces found themselves unable to operate outside of heavily fortified positions. Any Soviet foray into the countryside would have to be conducted with large amounts of manpower and heavy fire support, and often it simply wasn't worth it. The Americans, on the other hand, initially did much as the Soviets, wiping out major military opposition within a matter of weeks with overwhelming firepower. However, it was here that they showed a better aptitude for fighting an asymmetrical war against a non-conventional foe. Wherever American firepower went, it was followed by major civil relief programs with a focus on building infrastructure and restoring, if not improving, the lives of the civilian population. Very quickly, a complex system of diplomatic agreements and alliances arose between U.S. forces and the dozen of disparate groups who all claimed some piece of Iraq or Afghanistan for themselves. Ultimately, the effort would result in a half-won victory of sorts, which was still light years ahead of the total defeat suffered by the Soviets. Unfortunately, the U.S.'s insistence on fighting two insurgency wars simultaneously would force it to divide its assets and ultimately result in the mixed results we see today. Yet, all the expertise, technology, and troop experience gained from the insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan would come into play against the U.S. insurgents, and this time the U.S. military will find itself with major advantages it lacked in the Middle East. For starters, it has home field advantage, and its forces are no longer operating within a culture they don't understand very well. Cultural misunderstandings will be impossible, and by understanding the American culture, the U.S. military can better win the fight for hearts and minds, turning many would-be insurgents from their path and garnering the support of civilians who would have instead supported the insurgents. Secondly, it'll be fighting to unite a nation which actually wants to be united and has a national identity, making the process of re-establishing a stable political system far easier than it was in the Middle East. Iraq had huge sectarian divisions that plagued the country for decades and were barely kept in check by the authoritarian strongman. Afghanistan was itself also held together only by the very violent Taliban, who regularly used military power to enforce its grip over the people. Without the
I will go back to that comment about it would be easier because of a country that wants to be united. I don't know if you guys know, the United States is actually a very divided country, which has been sad. It's become so divided within probably the last 10 years between the two political parties, and it's just like it's been torn, and it's really a shame. And I'm not sure that it would be easy for them to come back and piece things together because of military. I think that they would need to approach it from a little bit different perspective personally.
These authoritarian figures forcibly uniting the nations together, Iraq and Afghanistan quickly fell to pieces that called to put back together. Afghanistan would prove especially difficult, as its people simply lacked the desire for national unity that nations in the West have had for centuries. Americans, however, have a very strong sense of national unity and lack the sectarian differences and ideological
Unity in weapons.
conflicts that would see the nation split up into a conglomerate of cabals in the case of national government collapse. Sure, Democrats and Republicans may often be at each other's throats, but ultimately, as national tragedy after national tragedy has shown, the American people stand united. As the old adage goes,
I would say a decade ago, correct. A decade ago, the American people would come together. But at this point, I don't know. I mean, my viewers are all across the board, US, UK, all over. At this point, there's literally one of those two groups that hate America. They don't like America. It literally makes no sense, but they think that America is a terrible place and all this stuff. So, and it's gotten to that point where, again, I think that possibly if there was a potential insurgency, I don't know if they would stand up against the military, if they would just accept it personally. I really don't know. It would be tough.
You're allowed to fight with family and call them names, but if anyone else tries to hurt your family, then you better watch out. This sense of unity will make the job of counterinsurgency far easier on American forces than it was in the Middle East, and make it far more difficult for American insurgents to exploit a mistrust of the U.S. military. Yet, while American insurgents are outgunned by the American military, they can take advantage of asymmetrical tactics to all but nullify the US military's overwhelming firepower. By following the same playbook as the Iraq and Afghanistan insurgencies, American insurgents could force US troops into close-quarters battles where they couldn't bring fire support, such as airstrikes or artillery bombardments, against them.
Correct.
American insurgents would also be able to enjoy the advantage of fighting a near-total urban warfare campaign, given the size and scope of US cities. As the first part of the 21st century has proven, urban warfare is the great equalizer between military powers, as it denies most of the technological advantages of a nation's military. Fighting instead is door-to-door and house-to-house, carried out by individual squads of soldiers and little more than rifles and gadgets they can carry on their person. With the US military numbering at just over 1 million, and with potentially millions of American insurgent forces, victory for the US military will be all but impossible. A fight between the US military and US citizens would be a dragged-out affair that would likely last as long as the overseas insurgencies. It would be less a war of weapons and more a war of words, with both sides trying to sway the majority of the population to its side. It's likely that in such a war, entire cities would go rogue, with local city governments refusing to outright support the US military or the insurgents, and simply wishing to be left out of the fighting. They would deny the military the right to operate in its streets, but also not wish to support an insurgency which will bring military action against it. Despite the huge glut of guns available to American citizens, the truth is that there'd be no major resupply effort courtesy of an outside power. In the Middle East, Afghani and Iraqi insurgents were kept well supplied by Iran, Russia, China, and Pakistan, amongst other actors, and trade routes into war zones often went through Pakistan, who refused to allow US forces to operate inside its borders and shut them down. In an American insurgency, however, there would be no neighboring power to supply the American insurgents, and the major trade routes into the US through which arms supplied by a foreign power could enter would all be very easily monitored and shut down by the US military. Within a year or two of heavy fighting, the American insurgency would find itself very low on ammo and very low on usable equipment. Yet the war would take a huge toll on the American economy as well, which would in turn directly affect the budget of the US military. With major parts of the economy disrupted by fighting or sabotage, the US military budget would rapidly shrink, and it would no longer be able to afford to operate its vast fleets of modern equipment. In the end, a war of attrition would settle in, and a winner is all but impossible to declare. It would come down to a sheer matter of will and which side would be willing to sacrifice the most to come out the ultimate victor. Yet as each side became more desperate, their actions would lose the support of the population they'd rely on, and thus lose the war for the hearts and minds. Who do you think would act?
Okay, so here's my a couple ideas. So I guess when I watched this, I thought it was like all the U.S. citizens going against the U.S. military. I didn't realize it was just a certain amount of insurgents, because in that aspect, how many? That is that's the question. Is then, well, how many insurgents are actually coming forward and doing this? If it's all U.S. citizens, then it's a whole different story, because again, that's 360 million. And if there's that many guns, that's a different, because then it also includes, hey, all your farmers, all of a sudden the U.S. military isn't getting food. They're not getting supplied anything as well. So if it's just an insurgency, then I'm kind of bummed because he didn't really give us a number of insurgents that were fighting the U.S. military. I like the idea, though, of the urban warfare or guerrilla warfare. I feel like with the insurgents, what they could possibly do is, with so many, is they could hit multiple cities at once, or attack multiple bases at once, or hold multiple places, to where it would spread out the U.S. military. Because you guys know the U.S. is huge. They can't take and hold all these places at once. So I mean, you could have like New York, L.A., Seattle, Portland, like literally all the major cities in all the states. And do all that. But yeah, I guess the video, it wasn't quite as much as I wanted, because I did want it to be a little bit more about, was it all the U.S. citizens, or at least give us a number of insurgents. But it didn't really give us that, because I think if you had all U.S. citizens, or even half of the population, 180 million versus the U.S. Army, I think it'd be a totally different story, and the game would be over, in my opinion. I think the U.S. citizens could defend themselves. But let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Also, let me know if you guys like this kind of reaction video. Seen a couple. I thought they were really interesting, because I love to watch these. It just shows just how honestly strong the U.S. military is. If you guys want to go watch some others, I'll link them down in the description below. They're pretty funny. and it's quite incredible. But yeah, let me know if you guys want me to do more of these reaction videos. I'd love to hear your feedback. And until next time, you guys, maximize those deductions and pay less in taxes. Have an awesome day.